Welcome to Tree Phenology Analysis with R. This is a module at the University of Bonn. My name is Eike Lüdeling, and today I'm going to talk about climate change again. There have already been two lectures on climate change. The first one was on the drivers of climate change, the second one on what we've seen so far, and this third part is going to be on future scenarios of our climate. So learning goals for today are that we want to learn about the use of future scenarios in climate change analysis. We also want to appreciate how climate scenarios help us address uncertainty about the future climate and understand the importance of climate scenario ensembles. Finally, we want to appreciate the challenge of working with such ensembles because it's not particularly easy. Future climate change. Well, what can we know about it? Obviously, we can't observe the future climate directly. This is evident, and this is why we need models. We need climate models to project future conditions. This, however, is pretty challenging because Earth's climate system is pretty complex, and there are various drivers that we already learned about, and also various feedback mechanisms that we have very hard time being able to fully predict. So we don't entirely know how things work, and this is why we have models, and that's why none of the models are really completely perfect so far. There are a number of credible climate models that have been developed. CSIRO in Australia has one, the Hadley Centre in the UK has one, and there are like 20 or so other climate analysis centers around the world that have credible climate models. But all of these models give slightly different results. Now, even though we can validate the models with past data, and that of course gives us some indication of whether they have a chance of being plausible and correct, there's still no way to know which one of these models, if any of them, is actually really capable of predicting the future climate accurately. But what are these models? Well, they're generally called general circulation models or also global climate models. In either case, the abbreviation is GCMs. So this is what you'll often see in the climate change literature, GCM. These are gridded 3D representations of Earth. You can see an illustration here on the side. This is kind of the structure of it. You see the Earth here in the center, and then around it we have this these voxels here, so to say. That you probably all know what pixels are, but voxels are the three-dimensional equivalent of a pixel, and so they describe the air near the Earth's surface, of course, but then also multiple layers that are deemed relevant for the way the climate behaves. Now, these models are supposed to contain all the major drivers of climate and all the major feedback mechanisms, ideally. Usually not all the feedback mechanisms are represented because that's difficult, but some are usually there. Now, running such a model, because the Earth is a big place, is a rather computationally expensive effort. So it is actually something that not kind of every one of us could do on our personal computer or on our smartphone. This actually requires supercomputing power and, really specialized working groups. That's why there are not so many of these GCMs. Usually some feedbacks may not be sufficiently represented. So for a long time, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, for example, the feedback between the land cover and the atmosphere had been pretty poorly represented. So that, of course, makes a big difference if land cover changes over multiple decades or centuries. To run these climate models, we need inputs regarding the drivers of climate change, and these are so-called climate scenarios. These are necessary because the drivers of climate may develop in different ways, especially the greenhouse emissions of the future are really unclear. As you all know, we're currently trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and of course we may succeed, ending up with relatively low emissions in the future, or we may not succeed and emissions will remain high or even increase. So this uncertainty is expressed by a range of emissions scenarios that were developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in a special report that accompanied his fourth assessment report, the AR4. In this report, the scientists developed so-called storylines which consisted of a range of climate scenarios. The most common scenarios are one that's called A1FI, that is a fossil intensive scenario, so the one where we just keep heavily relying on fossil fuels. There's the B1 emissions is kind of the opposite of that. It's a low emission scenario where we succeed at reducing our carbon footprint. The high emission scenario is one that you find pretty commonly in the literature. It's a high emission scenario, and A1B is intermediate. You see them illustrated in this figure here. In this case, well, as reference to the year 1990, which is well, this is just an index that's shown here, and 1990 equates to 1. So here's 1, and from there on we see emissions increasing or eventually even decreasing in some of the scenarios. So these scenarios they are 4 scenarios were used for a long time in the literature. They're not so common anymore because these scenarios have been replaced by the next generation that was published in connection with the IPCC's AR5, the 5th assessment report. And what is currently used are the so-called representative concentration pathways, the so-called RCPs. These are new greenhouse forcing scenarios from the 5th assessment report, and some of them are shown here, some of the most common ones. They have strange names. They're called RCP 8.5, for example, or RCP 2.6, and these numbers actually mean something. They're named after the additional radiative forcing in watts per square meters that is expected by the end of the 21st century. So roughly around the time indicated here, we expect that additional radiative forcing to be active. And the path to get there are these representative concentration pathways that are expressed by these numbers. Since these numbers express the additional radiative forcing, you can imagine that the higher this number is, the greater the warming that we'll expect. The highest common one, or the highest scenario that is commonly used, is the RCP 8.5. Sometimes you see RCP 2.6 as a particularly low emission scenario. 4.5 is also commonly found in the literature, and 6.0. In theory, you can have all kinds of other scenarios in addition, but those are rarely used, if ever. Now, once we've fed our climate model with these climate scenarios, we can run it, but then the results that we get, the output, is usually very coarse, because even though these models are a somewhat accurate representation of our planet, they have a very coarse grid cell. So these cells that are used are fairly large, like a degree or so much too large for any sort of local scale studies. This is why usually after we get outputs from these global models, we have to downscale the results. And downscaling is a process that aims to increase the resolution of the data set. It could be temporarily. We could be trying to downscale from yearly time steps, for example, to monthly time steps, etc. But it's usually used in a spatial sense, where we try to reduce the spatial resolution of the data set. For example, we may have our GCM outputs, you can see here, with a resolution of 100 to 250 kilometers. So one cell of this grid here, one pixel, is this size. Basically, the edge length of these pixels is 100 to 250 kilometers, so it's pretty large. And we want to reduce the cell size because, of course, we may be interested in kind of finer grained features. This is then ideally done through a process called dynamical downscaling, which is implemented with so-called RCMs, so regional climate models. And these follow similar principles as to the global ones, but they have more detail in terms of local and regional topography and geography, and only run for a certain section of the planet, which allows us to get a much higher resolution than if we were running things at a global scale. Again, it's a large computational effort, however, and these RCMs are also fairly specialized operations that not everyone can run. The advantage of this is that you get spatially coherent scenarios, which is quite important for hydrological studies. Because if, for example, if you compare the diagrams here on the right, up here we have the GCM output, and this is Central Europe here, and the Alps are barely visible. The big mountain range is barely visible. And for anyone who's been to high mountains, you'll know that, well, the weather and the climate depends a lot on where exactly you are in that mountain range. So if your mountain range is only 1 pixel, then of course the projections will not be particularly accurate. So a regional climate model allows you to get a lot more detail in that sense, and this, especially for hydrological studies, rainfall predictions, this is very important for predicting where you'll get lots of rainfall and where you won't. Usually this is an important first step, but often we still want more, still want a higher resolution, and we can add another step on top of this dynamical downscaling, which is so-called statistical downscaling, where you basically use a high resolution temperature map, for example, and calculate the difference between that temperature map and the average for that particular pixel of the RCM you're working on, and then you apply a so-called delta change procedure where you calculate the bias for each location that you're interested in, and then correct the RCM output by that bias. And so sometimes you get a fairly high resolution data set that way. You can see that here again in the lower map, where like every value of the Alps is now basically visible after such statistical downscaling. I also listed weather generators here because I'm in the chillR package that we'll be talking about in this module. I implemented a weather generator to implement temporal downscaling, so to reduce the time step of some of the climate scenarios that we can get from the global climate models. So this is usually applied to GCM outputs and then gives us a fairly good data set. We can also apply statistical downscaling directly to GCMs, and I have certainly done that in the past, and I still sometimes do. This is also, I think, not so problematic when we're just looking at temperature changes, which I'm mostly interested in. But as I mentioned before, if you want realistic predictions in terms of rainfall, precipitation, then this is not recommended, because once again, let's look up here. The rainfall predictions are really fairly unreliable when you have such giant pixel sizes here. Now let's look at the whole process that it takes to get from RCPs, so from these representative concentration pathways, to inputs for climate change impact models. So input for climate change impact models is by that I mean, well, predicted temperatures and predicted rainfall for the future that we can then use to, well, make an estimate of what happens to our biological systems. We start with these RCPs. Yeah? So here's one of these RCPs, representative concentration pathways. This is fed into a GCM. This is downscaled using an RCM, again statistically downscaled using some other supplementary data source, and then in the end we get temperature and precipitation projections. We may also want CO2 projections for the future, which of course are directly derived from the RCP. So with these three metrics, three variables, we can then run an impact model and make an impact projection. So what is going to happen to fruit trees or to some animals or to anything at all? Now, the problem, of course, is that we have many of these RCPs. We also have many of the GCMs and many downscaling mechanisms, many regional climate models even in some regions. We have different ways of statistical downscaling even. So in the end, there's quite a few ways of doing this. Yeah, so we could be doing this in many different ways. Yeah? So Now you see all the options we have here, and in the end we actually end up with lots of different impact projections that are derived from these different combinations of all the different steps in this process here. Now lots of methods and scenarios at each stage, and it's really not clear which one is best, because there are many climate models and we can't, as I said, we can't really tell which one is best. Same with the regional models, same with the RCPs. We may also be interested in different points in time, by the way, so that even multiplies these scenarios even more. Now, the recommendation from climate scientists is pretty clear. We should use all of them. Yeah, so calculate everything for every single one of these combinations ideally and look at what comes out of it. And what you get to then is the so-called scenario ensembles. Ensembles means together, and it's in French, and it's the use of all or at least many options for making future scenarios. So we're supposed to use many RCPs, many time horizons, possibly many GCMs, RCMs, downscaling methods, etc. So here you see a full ensemble from the IPCC, the fifth assessment report in some study published in Nature here. Yeah? So these are the different temperature anomalies produced by 36 climate models here and 114 realizations, so 114 model runs, I imagine this means. So yeah, that's quite a lot, of course. And then we only have the climate. By the way, these are only the GCM runs for now. Yeah? So of course then the other steps will still come afterwards, the downscaling and the regional climate models, etc. And then possibly we may also need many impact models, because of course even if we have the climate perfect and at the end of this entire process, we may still have uncertainties about the biological responses, the responses of our biological systems. Even there we may not be completely clear of how to describe them. So you could argue that even at that stage we should have multiple models that describe different ways our trees and our plants and our animals might behave. So a full ensemble requires large data processing capacity. And again, there are some facilities out there that can do it for the GCMs, but if you multiply this out by all the other steps, you really get a fairly unrealistic situation. And this is very rarely, if ever, achieved, especially in agricultural studies. And the reason, of course, is that people who do agricultural studies are agricultural scientists for the most part, and not data processing junkies. So, unfortunately, quite often when we do see these studies in agriculture that actually apply these full ensembles, they are actually not done by agricultural scientists, and they often have certain deficiencies on the agricultural side. And in agriculture, it may even be more complicated than what we've seen so far. Because agriculture, managing an agricultural system, managing a farm, is largely about risk assessment. And especially when it comes to tree crops, and we'll get to that later in this module. And for agricultural risk assessment, we should consider many weather scenarios. So maybe we even need, well, if we have all these CO2 and temperature precipitation scenarios here, we may even need weather scenarios for risk assessment, meaning we take one of these inputs here and generate like a population of 100 years of representative weather, so we can get a feeling for in how many of these years we face a drought, or in how many of these years we face a heat wave, etc. So this is actually rather important for farmers, because they don't only need to know the average climate in the future, they need to know, well, the distribution of the various weather metrics that concern them. And then we get to an enormous number of impact projections here in the end. So these best practice procedures that are given to us by climate scientists are so complex that they're actually largely unrealistic. It is very hard and really rarely achieved that like for agricultural scientists to do this, or any scientists for that matter. And then, as I mentioned, we haven't even started addressing uncertainty in the impact model. Because even though in agriculture we have a bunch of models, crop models and chill models that we learn about, etc., they're not actually perfect. There are a lot of questions still in there, and there's a lot of uncertainty that still comes into a projection at that step. So if we invest an enormous amount of resources, more than we actually have, in getting the climate inputs to our models perfect, we still actually haven't addressed what may be the largest part of the uncertainty about future performance of our systems. Now let's look at what future temperatures are likely to be. I mean, I'm sure you all know what is predicted for now. We're likely to face dramatic warming in the future. We're already seeing quite a bit of that, and these are projected changes here for the RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5 for the planet. All areas here that are dotted are areas where the models are basically completely in agreement on the direction of changes that are coming. It is really only this hashed area in the North Atlantic here on the left where we're not entirely sure of the direction, and maybe a few areas that do not have dots here. Basically, you see no blue in this map on either side. You see lots of orange, a bit of yellow only, but mostly orange, red, and dark red. And this basically means warming, and on the right side here, severe warming. And this is warming between the period 1986 to 2005 and 2081 to 2100, so by the end of the 21st century. The RCP 8.5 scenario, which is shown on the right here, is pretty scary. We're basically seeing increases in temperature well between 2 and 11 degrees on our planet, and 11 degrees being kind of the polar region. The Arctic is shown in that color here, which means dramatic changes in that ecosystem, possibly a loss of the sea ice almost entirely, certainly during the summer, dramatic melting of the glaciers at the ice sheet in Greenland. So this is not a scenario that we want to live in, I think. On the left side, things look a little better, but even here we see changes that will certainly have quite severe impacts on agriculture, on our human systems, and also on natural ecosystems. Now, in terms of rainfall, things aren't quite so easy. Future precipitation varies quite a bit locally and also across climate models. And the changes are really quite a bit less clear. You see that here. First of all, they're much smaller in magnitude, especially for the RCP 2.6 on the left side here. We see relatively small changes. This is in percent of the current level. For most locations on Earth, they're between, well, -10 and +10%. That's the average, however, and there is, of course, among the models, there's quite a bit of disagreement, in fact. In RCP 8.5, so the high warming scenario on the right side, the changes are quite a bit stronger. Everything is stronger, of course, if the forcing increases. And if this scenario becomes reality, well, we actually do see quite significant changes here, massive increases in precipitation in the polar regions and around the equator, decreases in rainfall, increasingly dry conditions in the area shown in brown here, including possibly Central Europe. But this is quite a bit less clear, and there's still lots of uncertainty. But there are concerning forecasts for many world regions here already. Now let's go back to future temperatures, because that's somehow easier to deal with. Of course, one thing that we should always consider, like we often see these projections for 2100, and that seems to be the end of time, but of course it will not be. Warming will not end in 2100, because the CO2 will still be in the atmosphere, and if we haven't stopped emitting by then, it'll still be rising. And yeah, CO2 remains in the atmosphere for a long time, and these future temperature increases are actually locked in. So what IPCC projects here in its 2014 report is further increases. And these, of course, will continue into the future. What you see here is projections until 2300. And by that time, according to this RCP 8.5, the high warming trajectory, the global temperatures may increase by 8 degrees or even 12 degrees by 2300. And this would be a completely different world than the one we're living in now. In particular, sea level would be much higher, and of course temperatures would be quite unbearable in many parts of the planet. We'd better try and make it something like RCP 2.6 if we want our grandchildren and their grandchildren to still be happily living in roughly the same climatic conditions that we're experiencing now. Yeah, the business as usual trajectory really looks rather scary. Even just the median increase projected for that is not a world we want to live in. And one thing is possibly not even represented in many of these models. And that is the so-called tipping points of climate. Now, what's a tipping point? That's a question that this guy here is also asking. A tipping point, is a point where some small change happens and then all of a sudden something big happens. And that doesn't go away anymore. It's basically a point where a system can suddenly transition to a new state. You can see that illustrated here by these balls here. This top situation, we don't have such a tipping point, but anywhere in the other images here, you see this ball here is somewhat stable where it is now up here on the higher plane, and but it may just with a bit of a nudge to the side, it may end up in this different different system state down here in this trough on this side. We're not quite sure how high the threshold is between these different states, and there are many of these tipping points, and for each one we're not quite sure how sensitive the system is, if there's just a tiny little ridge here, or if there's a substantial hill that'll be very difficult to get past. We don't know that. But now, what are these tipping points? One major example is the global ocean currents that are largely driven by the sinking of cold, salty water in the North Atlantic. That's basically the pump of basically the whole global ocean circulation. It's probably a bit simplified, but in essence it's often described that way. It's, for example, the driver of the Gulf Stream that ensures relatively warm conditions in Northern Europe. And it is being slowed down by increasing freshwater input, meltwater from Greenland. Greenland ice sheets, there's fresh water coming in that's not salty, and can weaken the pump of the so-called oceanic conveyor belt. So the reason why this is happening, so up here is the area where the water sinks down to the bottom of the ocean, and the reason why it sinks down is that here the water has become pretty cold because it moved up to the north here, to the cold region, and it is pretty salty. The reason why it's salty is that much of the water passed through the Caribbean, a very warm and shallow sea, where lots of water evaporates and the salt gets left behind. So the salt content here is very high. The water then gets transmitted here with the North Atlantic current to this region here. The Gulf Stream then warms Northern Europe, which is nice for us. But much of the water is also cooled down here again and then sinks, because the heaviest water we have in the ocean is cold, salty water, and that is formed here. Goes down, and then basically this fuels this current here, this undercurrent that goes below, that passes below the Gulf Stream and down here, down the coast of South America, and then basically through the entire system of the world's oceans. So that's this oceanic pump, and with meltwater from Greenland and from the probably the sea ice of the Arctic coming in to the system, the salt content decreases, because this is fresh water. From after it's been ice, it has no more salt. So this is fresh water. The salt content goes down. The water gets less heavy, and this pump is slowed down. And it's called a tipping point because, first of all, it's already led to a weakening of the Gulf Stream that can already be observed. But it's also been shown in the past this can actually stop the global oceanic circulation largely, or at least slow it to the point where the climate actually shifts to a different state. So there was one event, for example, at the end of the last ice age, where all of a sudden, for like a few thousand years, after it had already been warming, the cold came back. And you saw, in the pollen record and whatever records we had from the time, we saw these Arctic plants coming back, these tundra plants coming back. It's the so-called Younger Dryas period, and it's currently hypothesized that this is actually related to exactly such an inflow of meltwater into the North Atlantic. So it's happened before, it could happen again. It's not as unlikely as maybe it may seem. But there are more tipping points. We actually have several tipping points that have already been shown to be moving. And here's a quick overview. I just want to walk you through some of them. We see up here, we see a reduction in the sea ice area of the Arctic, which, as if you remember the lecture on the drivers of climate change, will reduce the albedo of this area. So will lead to less radiation being reflected back into space, and that will result in a further warming of the planet. The Greenland ice sheet here, ice loss is accelerating. There's a certain point when the Greenland ice sheet loses its mass, where the peak of the top of the glacier, it actually moves down in altitude. Currently, the top of the Greenland glacier is like up to 3,000 meters high or something like that. But as it melts, of course, this elevation will decrease, meaning that the top of the glacier moves to warmer layers of air where it will start melting further. Other tipping points are kind of in the boreal forests, where we see fires and also pest dynamics changing. We've had massive fires, of course, in the world's forest this year. California is not a boreal forest, but we've had them in Siberia, for example, which, I mean, of course, there have also been forests elsewhere. And in California, in Australia, we had forest fires this year, massive forest fires in Brazil. But these are here the boreal forests, which, well, so far haven't really had such burning problems, but all of a sudden that seemed to be happening. We have, well, possibly increasingly frequent droughts in the rainforest. There's some evidence of that yet, of that already. It's not all that dramatic yet, but it could get worse. We've already talked about the Atlantic circulation possibly slowing down. Apparently this has already happened since the 1950s. We have permafrost areas, especially in Siberia and Canada, that are thawing. So it warms in that area, in that region here. The ground is usually permanently frozen, and that frozen soil has stored lots and lots of carbon, but also methane. Well, methane also contains carbon, but carbon dioxide and methane is released by thawing permafrost, and that could be a further acceleration of climate change. Coral reefs are starting to die off on a large scale, which is more of an ecological tipping point, because there's, well, a wealth of biodiversity that is threatening to be lost. And then we have various processes also going on in the Antarctic, where well, ice sheets are losing mass quite rapidly, and in some cases, it's been shown that kind of warming seawater actually leads to warm water creeping in underneath the glaciers and accelerating basically the slide into the sea. So there's a lot of things that are happening on this planet that we're not currently totally sure on how they'll develop and how they'll respond to the warming that the planet is currently experiencing. And some of these may cause positive climate feedback. Again, positive is not good for us. Positive means accelerating climate change. Yeah, and many of them have dramatic ecological consequences. For example, there's an entire food chain basically on the Arctic that relies on the sea ice, even on small algae growing on the underside of the ice. And all of that basically that ultimately ends up, well, that whole chain basically leads to even large sea mammals and all kinds of other creatures. That is all in jeopardy if these ecosystems get damaged by the warming that we're causing. Now let's look at the relationship between emissions and temperatures. Obviously, future temperatures depend strongly on our emissions. And for every level of warming, we can assign a total carbon emissions budget. We understand the climate system well enough today that we can translate our emissions directly into the warming that is expected. So basically, in this diagram, this knowledge is summarized, and you can tell for every level of warming that you think we can tolerate what total emissions of humanity since 1870 we can tolerate, we can afford. So if you say we can afford 4 degrees of warming, then basically, well, we have a lot of time. Yeah, we can emit a total of, well, what is it, 2,000 or something gigatons carbon, which is 77,000 gigatons CO2 or something of the sort. Now, we don't want 4 degrees warming, however, and our leaders have agreed in the Paris Agreement that we should try and restrict the warming to 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is here, and you can tell that if we move over this direction here, well, we end up with a carbon budget, a total carbon budget of, well, only something like 700 or 800 gigatons of carbon, or, well, about maybe 2,400 or something gigatons of CO2 equivalent. Now, remember that at the moment we are emitting about 40 gigatons per year. So, assuming that this is 2,400 here, we could only afford these kind of emissions for a total of 60 years. And of course, we have already emitted a lot. So, we probably only have, well, maybe something like 10 years or 20 years left to basically completely eat up the carbon budget that we had to be able to afford these 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there is really cause for very urgent action if we're really serious about reaching this 1.5 degrees goal. There are some pathways, of course, that lead us to this, but they are ambitious. And the emissions must come down very, very quickly if we want any chance of achieving this. So at the latest in 2060, we must really be CO2 neutral from the looks of it. And this is, well, what has been proposed as plausible pathways. So basically from this, and well, remember that the emissions have risen very strongly to the left of this figure, but now from this peak here we have to crash down very, very quickly to zero, possibly even lower than zero if we don't manage to do this fast enough. So this is pretty ambitious, and of course the longer we delay, the longer we move straight or even keep going up further, then again, if we're serious about our emissions budget, the decline here has to be even steeper, and we have to get our emissions to zero even more quickly. Now these gray areas here show pathways with a significant overshoot. An overshoot means, well, we have to end up with a significant amount of negative emissions. Negative emissions are often associated with some sort of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, either through growing lots of trees, lots of plants, or through some technology that doesn't really exist yet. So, but regardless of the goal, yeah, of whether we reach it or not, I mean, of course, it is important to try our best to reach these goals. But even if we don't reach them, I mean, we have to be completely clear that every ton of CO2 that we blow into the atmosphere makes humanity's future worse. Yeah, so this is not some sort of competition where by the end of the game we have to have like one more goal than the other team or something of the sort. Or that we just barely have to reach the target by 2050. As long as we reach it by 2050, everything is fine. No, that's not the case. We should really be trying to reduce our emissions as fast as we can, and as aggressively as we can, because every additional ton of CO2 up in the atmosphere makes our children's future a tiny bit less bright. Now, conclusions for today. Climate scientists use representative concentration pathways to produce future climate scenarios. These are the important scenarios to know now. The emission scenarios were also interesting, but they are really a thing of the past. Accurate representation of uncertainty is very important in any sort of climate change projections. So, for example, in science, if you're trying to publish a climate change study and you only have one scenario, a proper climate change journal will not normally accept your work. So this is really very important. And ideally, we should use these ensembles of many RCP scenarios, climate models, and data processing methods. But using full ensembles is often impossible to implement, especially for agricultural scientists like us. That's it for today. There's one more lesson on climate change, which will deal with impact projection approaches. So once we have all these scenarios of future temperatures and rainfall and maybe CO2, how can we then derive from these scenarios the responses of our agricultural and biological systems? So see you next time.